to the Blue Farmer. Join our growing farm community by subscribing and tell us in the comments your location and local time as you watch this story. Now, David will bring today's story to life.
There is a particular kind of starting point that most people never have to understand from the inside. Not the starting point of modest circumstances, of a family with little money but a house and a meal, and the ordinary infrastructure of belonging somewhere. Not the starting point of a difficult childhood that nevertheless ended each day with a roof and a bed, and the assumption that tomorrow would arrive in the same place as today. The starting point that most people never have to understand is the one where none of those things are guaranteed. Where you are 16 years old and you have been told, in terms that were not open to negotiation, that you are no longer welcome in the only home you have ever known. Where the arithmetic of what you possess reduces to the clothes on your back, the $43 in your pocket from 2 months of odd jobs, and the particular clarity that arrives when you have no safety net and no one expecting you anywhere. That was where Donnie Farrell started. Not from modest, from nothing at all. What he built from that starting point, not quickly, not easily, not without years of work that most people with more comfortable starting points would have found impossible to sustain, is the kind of story that a farming community in southwestern Ohio tells differently depending on who in the community is telling it. Some tell it as a success story, which it is. Some tell it as a lesson about what a person can do when they have to, which it also is. Some tell it as the story of what a $50 Oliver tractor did for a 16-year-old boy who had nothing else. That version is also true, and it is the best place to start. Part 1. The summer of 1962. Donnie Farrell left his father's house in Darke County, Ohio, on a Thursday morning in June of 1962 with a paper bag containing 2 shirts, 1 extra pair of pants, his work boots, and the $43. He was 16 years and 4 months old. He did not have a plan. Having a plan requires a foundation from which to plan, options to evaluate, resources to deploy, someone whose couch you can sleep on while you figure things out. Donnie had none of these things. What he had was a direction, away from the house on the county road outside Ansonia, and toward anywhere that was not that house. He walked 3 miles to the center of Ansonia. He sat on the steps of the grain elevator for 2 hours, watching the morning traffic on the main road, trying to organize the $43 and the 2 shirts into something that looked like a plan. The man who interrupted this attempt was named Gus Widener, who ran a small farm operation 6 miles outside of town, and who had stopped at the grain elevator on legitimate business, and who had noticed, as practical farming men notice things, that the boy on the steps had the particular stillness of someone who was doing serious thinking, rather than the ordinary waiting of someone between errands. Gus was 54 years old, direct in the way of men who have been farming in the same county for 30 years, and have learned that directness is more efficient than circumspection. He asked the boy what his situation was. Donnie told him the outline. Gus asked if he could work. Donnie said he could. Gus said he had a spare room in the farmhouse and meals and $7 a week for a working hand who would do what needed doing without needing to be told twice. He said the work was real farm work, long days, physical, no glamour in it. Donnie said when did he start? Gus said right now, if he was ready. Donnie picked up the paper bag and got in the truck. This was, as it turned out, the most important decision of Donnie Farrell's life, not because of what Gus offered, though what Gus offered was genuinely the thing that made everything else possible, but because of the specific circumstance of Gus Widener's farm equipment situation, which Donnie did not yet know about, and which was about to become very relevant. Part 2. The Widener Farm and What Was in the Back Pasture. Gus Widener farmed 112 acres in Darke County with more equipment than he needed and less money than he wanted, which was a situation he had arrived at through the particular series of acquisitions and inheritances and failed trades that farm equipment inventories accumulate over decades when no one is ruthlessly culling. He had a 1952 Oliver 88 diesel that ran. He had a 1947 Oliver 70 row crop that also ran mostly. He had a collection of implements, cultivators, planters, discs, that ranged from functional to marginally functional to aspirational. And in the back pasture, half hidden by a stand of volunteer cedar that had grown up around it over 8 years, he had a 1956 Oliver 88 diesel that did not run and that he had been ignoring since 1954 when the injection pump had failed and the repair estimate had exceeded what the machine was worth in its current condition. The 1956 Oliver had been sitting in that pasture for 8 years. It had been sitting long enough for the cedar to establish, for the wheel rims to rust through to pitting, for the seat to degrade to a condition that was more archaeological than functional. It had been sitting long enough for Gus to stop thinking of it as a machine and start thinking of it as part of the landscape. When Donnie Farrell arrived at the Widener farm in June of 1962, the first thing he did after putting his paper bag in the spare room and eating the lunch that Gus's wife, Miriam, put in front of him without ceremony, was walk the farm. Not because anyone asked him to, because walking a new place is what you do when you are 16 years old and have just arrived somewhere and need to understand what you've arrived at. He found the 1956 Oliver in the back pasture on that first afternoon. He stood at the fence looking at it for a long time. He had been around tractors his entire life. His father had farmed, badly and with bitterness, but he had farmed, and the equipment had been present throughout Donnie's childhood as a backdrop to the work he had been required to do from a very young age. He knew what a functional tractor looked like, and he knew what a broken one looked like, and the machine in the back pasture looked broken in ways that were visible from the fence. But it did not look permanently broken. That was the specific judgment that Donnie formed, standing at the fence that first afternoon, and it was a judgment that required something more than casual observation. The cedar had grown around the machine but not through it. The engine block was intact. The sheet metal was dented but present. The basic architecture of the machine was structurally sound beneath the years of neglect. A failed injection pump was a specific failure in a specific component. A specific failure in a specific component was not the same as a machine that was beyond repair. He went back to the house and helped Gus with the evening chores and did not say anything about the Oliver in the back pasture. He thought about it for 3 weeks before he asked. Part 3. The $50 transaction. 3 weeks into his work at the Widener farm, Donnie had confirmed several things. He had confirmed that Gus Widener was a fair man, who paid what he said he'd pay, and expected the work he said he expected, and did not add additional demands once the original agreement was established. He had confirmed that Miriam Widener fed the hired hands without distinction from the family, which was a detail that mattered more than it might sound to a 16-year-old who had been eating irregularly for the 3 weeks before he arrived on the grain elevator steps. He had confirmed that the 1956 Oliver in the back pasture was what he'd thought it was, a machine with a specific component failure, and the rest of the structure in a condition that was poor but not terminal. He had gone back to look at it 4 more times, each time getting closer, each time assessing more specifically. He had crawled under it on the second visit, lying in the pasture grass, looking at the engine from below. He had checked the compression by feel on the 3rd visit. A crude assessment, but useful. He had found the injection pump on the 4th visit, pulled back what housing was accessible without tools, confirmed that the pump was the failure point. He had also, in the evenings when Gus's farm library was accessible, looked at what he could find about Oliver 88 diesel injection pump systems. Gus had a collection of old farm magazines going back to the early 1950s, and 2 Oliver service publications that had come with one of the machines and that nobody had read in years. Donnie had read them. He had read them carefully enough to understand the injection pump failure in the context of the broader system, and to form a view about whether the repair was within the range of what a 16-year-old with no formal mechanical training but good hands and careful attention could accomplish. He thought it was. He asked Gus about the Oliver in the back pasture on a Saturday morning before the day's work started. Gus said it had been back there since 1954. He said the injection pump had gone, and the repair estimate from the Oliver dealer in Greenville had been more than the machine was worth to him. Donnie asked what Gus would take for it. Gus looked at him. He said, "You want to buy that thing?" Donnie said he'd like to try. Gus thought about it for a moment. He said, "It's been out there 8 years. I've got nothing in it at this point." He said, $50 and it's yours. Donnie had $43 when he arrived and had saved $18 in 3 weeks. He had $61. He paid Gus the $50 that Saturday morning and received in exchange a verbal acknowledgement that the Oliver in the back pasture was now his property. He had $11 left. He had a broken tractor. He did not have a shop, a set of tools, a parts source, a mechanical mentor, or any formal training in diesel engine repair. He started work the following morning. Part 4. The Repair, Summer and Fall, 1962. The repair of the 1956 Oliver 88 diesel took 5 months. It took 5 months not because the mechanical work was 5 months of work, but because the mechanical work was being done by a 16-year-old with $11, which meant that every component that needed to be replaced or machined or sourced had to be paid for out of the $7 weekly wage that Gus continued to pay, less the portion that went to the small fund Donnie had started for the expenses that would inevitably come. The injection pump was the primary repair, but the injection pump was not the only repair. When you pull apart a machine that has been sitting in a pasture for 8 years, you find the 8 years. Donnie found a cracked fuel line that had been the original cause of the injection pump failure. A crack that had allowed air into the system and caused cavitation damage in the pump. He found 2 injector nozzles that were clogged and needed to be cleaned and recalibrated. He found an oil seal on the rear axle that had dried and cracked and would leak the moment he put oil back in the housing. He found all of this the way you find things on an unfamiliar machine, by systematic examination, by following each system from input to output, by asking what could cause what, and working backward from the failure to the source. He had no one to teach him this method. It was the method that made sense to him, and when a method makes sense to a careful person, it produces results. The injection pump was beyond his ability to rebuild with the tools and knowledge he had. He accepted this limitation without self-deception and found a different solution. He drove, Gus lent him the truck on 3 Saturdays, to every farm auction within 40 miles over the course of 2 months, looking for Oliver 88 parts. He found an injection pump from a 1955 Oliver 88 that had burned in a barn fire and whose owner was selling the salvageable components. The pump was intact and functional. He paid $12 for it, more than a week's wages, carefully saved. He installed it himself, following the service publication he had memorized over weeks of evening reading. He was precise. He was patient. He made no shortcuts because he understood that shortcuts in mechanical work produce failures, and failures in a machine that cost $50 plus months of work were not acceptable. The Oliver ran for the first time under Donnie's ownership on a Saturday afternoon in late October of 1962. He did not celebrate. He drove it in a slow circle around the back pasture from which he'd pulled it, listening to the engine, feeling the transmission through the controls, assessing. The engine ran rough on the first 2 circuits, air in the new fuel line, working its way out. By the 4th circuit, it had smoothed. By the 6th, it sounded the way an Oliver 88 diesel should sound, a deep, measured, slightly lumpy idle that settled into a clean pull under throttle. He parked it beside the Widener equipment barn. Gus came out of the house when he heard it running. He stood at the barn door looking at the Oliver that had been in the back pasture for 8 years, and that was now idling in his equipment yard, and his expression was one that Donnie would remember for the rest of his life. Not surprise exactly, because Gus had known the machine could be fixed, but the specific expression of a man who had not fully believed that this particular boy would actually do it. Gus said, "You fixed it." Donnie said the engine ran clean. He said the hydraulics needed work, but it was usable. Gus nodded. He said, "That pump cost you most of what you earned this summer." Donnie said it had. Gus said, "What are you going to do with it?" Donnie said, "Work." Part 5. What work meant in Darke County in 1963. What work meant specifically was custom field work. Darke County, Ohio, in the early 1960s, had a well-established custom work market. Farmers who owned machinery hired it out to neighboring farmers who didn't own the specific implement needed for a specific job. This was not unusual in the farming communities of the upper Midwest. What was unusual was a 17-year-old who owned a repaired Oliver 88 diesel, a working disc, and a set of cultivators, and who was available for custom hire at prices that reflected his specific cost structure, which was low because he had no notes on anything and because he lived at the Widener farm on the arrangement that had started the previous summer. Gus had offered, unprompted, to continue the living arrangement after the first summer ended. He had done this in the particular way that practical men make practical offers. without sentiment, with directness, and with terms that were honest about what both parties were getting. He told Donnie that the spare room and the meals were available as long as Donnie was working the farm, and as long as the arrangement served both of them. He said it wasn't charity. He said a working hand who lived on the farm was more useful than one who lived elsewhere, and Donnie had proven to be a useful hand. Donnie had accepted. He had continued the Widener farm work at the original terms through the winter of 1962 to 63, adding to his equipment fund whenever the farm income and custom work income allowed. The custom work began in the spring of 1963. He had knocked on doors, literally driven the Oliver down the county road, and stopped at farms where he could see field work that needed doing, and knocked on doors and asked if they needed custom hire. The first 3 farms said no, or said they had their own equipment, or said they'd let him know. The 4th farm, the Hendrickson place, 2 miles south of the Widener property, had a wet corner in the east field that had never been properly drained, and that they were trying to work before the window closed. He worked the Hendrickson corner for 2 days. He did it correctly, properly timed passes, watching the soil condition, not working it too wet. Hendrickson paid him $4 an hour, which was the going rate for custom tractor work in Darke County in 1963, and the 2 days produced $32. He went back to the Widener farm that Friday evening and put $32 in the equipment fund. The fund was building slowly, but it was building. Part 6. The First Land, 1966. Donnie Farrell was 20 years old when he rented his first land. The land belonged to an elderly widow named Peck, whose husband had farmed 40 acres outside of Ansonia for 30 years, and who had died in 1964, leaving a farm operation that she could not run and did not want to sell, not yet, not while she was deciding what to do. She wanted a tenant. She wanted the ground farmed correctly, and the rent paid regularly, and nothing complicated. Donnie had heard about the Peck land through Gus, who had known the Peck family for 20 years, and who had mentioned to Elsie Peck at the right moment that he knew a young man who farmed carefully and paid his obligations and who might be interested. Elsie Peck had said she'd hear from him. Donnie had gone to see her on a Sunday afternoon. He had dressed in the best clothes he owned, which were not impressive but were clean and pressed, because Miriam Widener had told him that how you presented yourself to an older woman whose land you wanted to rent was not irrelevant to the outcome. He had brought the farm ledger he had been keeping since the custom work started. 3 years of income and expense recorded precisely. The equipment fund documented, the custom work hours and rates itemized. He had put the ledger on the table. He had told Elsie Peck what he could offer for rent, which was fair but not high, and he had told her why the number was what it was. He had showed her the 3 years of ledger entries. He had said that he would farm the ground correctly and pay the rent on time and leave the land in better condition than he found it. Elsie Peck had looked at the ledger for a long time. She had looked at Donnie. She had said, "You've been keeping this since you were 17?" He had said yes, since March of 1963. She had said, "Your handwriting is very neat." He had said he'd worked at it. She had said yes to the tenancy. He had driven back to the Widener farm and sat in the truck in the lane for a few minutes before going inside. 40 acres, his first rented ground. The equipment fund had built over 3 years to the point where he had a second implement, a used planter he'd bought at a dispersal sale the previous fall, and the Oliver was running well and could work the ground. The 40 acres was manageable. It was a start. He went inside and told Gus and Miriam. Miriam made a small celebration of the supper that evening, a better cut of meat than usual, a pie that hadn't been planned. Gus shook his hand. Neither of them said anything elaborate. They were not elaborate people. But the supper was better than usual, and the pie was there, and Donnie understood what that meant and said thank you in the way you say thank you when the words don't quite cover the thing. Part 7. The Equipment Strategy. Between 1963 and 1972, Donnie Farrell built an equipment fleet with the same systematic patience that he had applied to repairing the 1956 Oliver in Gus Widener's back pasture. He did not buy new. Not once, not with favorable rates, not when the Oliver dealer in Greenville ran promotions that the other farmers in the county were participating in. He had done the arithmetic on new equipment financing at age 17, sitting with the Oliver Service publication and a pencil, and the arithmetic had produced a conclusion he did not revisit. The interest on borrowed equipment consumed the margin that margin-thin farming could not afford to lose. He bought used, at dispersal sales, at estate auctions, from farmers who were getting out or upgrading. He bought with cash, the equipment fund that had started with the $50 Oliver transaction and had been building from custom work income and farm income since 1963. He bought machines that were older than their sellers wanted to keep but younger than their failures, machines with specific problems that he understood well enough to fix, and that therefore sold for less than their functional value. By 1967 he had the rebuilt 1956 Oliver 88 diesel, a 1959 Oliver 88 diesel that he'd bought at auction for $210, and that needed a new head gasket and a valve grind, a full set of row crop implements, and a used grain wagon. He was renting 90 acres by then, the Peck 40 and 50 additional acres from a neighboring farm. By 1970, he had added a 1963 Oliver 1800 diesel, the larger machine that let him work the ground faster, which mattered because his rented acreage was growing and the planting and harvest windows did not expand when your acreage did. He had bought the 1800 at an estate sale in Preble County for $380, which was below market for a functioning 1800 because the estate executor had not known exactly what a functioning 1963 Oliver 1800 was worth, and Donnie had. By 1972, he was renting 140 acres. He was 26 years old. He had no equipment debt. He had no land debt. He had the Widener farm still as his base. Gus had offered him a share of the ownership in 1969, a conversation that deserves its own telling. And the equipment fund had never run dry because he had never let it run dry. The Oliver 88 from Gus's back pasture was still in the fleet, still working. He had rebuilt it comprehensively in 1965, a full overhaul during the winter, done in the Widener equipment barn with a halogen work light, and the Oliver service manual, and the patience of a man who had learned patience young. The rebuilt engine was good for another decade. He knew it because he had done the work, and he knew what good work felt like. Part 8. The Widener Farm, and what Gus said in 1969. The offer that Gus Widener made in 1969 came on an evening in February when the fieldwork was stopped by weather, and there was nothing pressing, and the two men were sitting at the kitchen table after supper, in the way that farming men sit after supper when the day is over, and there is nothing to do but think. Gus was 61. He and Miriam did not have children. He had been watching Donnie Farrell farm alongside him for 7 years, and he had formed a view about what he was watching that he had not said out loud until that February evening. He said, "I've been thinking about what happens to this farm." Donnie looked at him. Gus said he didn't have anyone to leave it to in the ordinary way. He said the farm was 112 acres that had been the Widener family's for 60 years, and that he was not indifferent to what happened to it. He said he had watched Donnie farm for 7 years, and he had formed a view about the quality of the farming. He said, "I want to offer you an ownership share, not a gift, a purchase, a fair price over time, with an arrangement that gives you the farm in stages." Donnie said he was listening. Gus laid out the proposal. 25% ownership now, at a price that reflected the farm's value and that could be paid from farming income over 3 years. A right of first purchase on the remaining 75% when Gus and Miriam were ready to transfer, at a price that would be set fairly at the time of transfer. Donnie asked why him. Gus said, "Because you fixed that Oliver in my back pasture at 16 years old with $11 in your pocket and no one to help you, and you did it correctly, and you farmed this ground for 7 years without cutting corners when cutting corners would have been easier and no one would have known." He paused. "I know what kind of farmer you are. I've watched long enough to know." Donnie said he'd need to think about it. Gus said he'd expect nothing less. Donnie thought about it for 2 weeks. He talked to nobody about it. He walked the Widener farm fields alone on 3 different evenings, looking at the ground the way he had looked at the Oliver in the back pasture in 1962. Not just what it was, but what it could become. He said yes. The 25% transfer happened in the spring of 1969, documented properly through an attorney in Ansonia. The Widener farm was, from that point, in part, Donnie Farrell's farm. He paid for the share from farming income over 3 years, exactly as Gus had proposed, and never missed a scheduled payment. Part 9. What the community had been saying. The farming community of Darke County, Ohio, had been watching Donnie Farrell since 1962, with the particular attention that farming communities pay to unusual things, and the assessment it had arrived at by the mid-1960s was mixed in the way that community assessments of unusual things are always mixed. Some of the assessment was generous. The farmers who had hired him for custom work had seen the quality of the work, the care he took with timing and soil conditions, the reliability of showing up when he said he would, the fact that his equipment was maintained well enough that it didn't break down in the middle of a job. They had referred him to other farmers. They had said, in the specific terms that farming communities use for recommendation, "Donnie Farrell does good work and his equipment is sound. If you need custom hire, call him before you call anybody else." Some of the assessment was skeptical. The men who had known his father, the drinking and the bitterness and the eventual complete failure of the Farrell farm operation, carried the father's reputation into the son's account without fully distinguishing between the two. There were farmers in the county who heard the name Farrell and shook their heads slightly, not from malice, just from the association. There were farmers who said when Donnie's custom work came up in conversation that they'd wait and see. There were farmers who said that a boy who started with nothing more often than not ended with nothing. These assessments were made without hostility and without knowledge of what Donnie was actually building. The equipment fund, the ledger, the careful accumulation of rented acres, the systematic approach to machinery that had produced a functional fleet from a $50 investment. They were made from the outside, from the visible evidence, which in the early years was a young man with a repaired Oliver, and no family land and no apparent advantages. By 1970, when Donnie was renting 120 acres and part owning the Weidner farm and his equipment fleet was valued at several times what the most skeptical of his neighbors would have believed, the assessment had shifted. Not dramatically. Communities don't dramatically revise their assessments. They update them incrementally as the evidence accumulates. But by 1970, the farmers who had said wait and see were seeing something they had not fully anticipated, and the farmers who had said good work and sound equipment had been saying it for 7 years and were beginning to have their assessment confirmed at a scale that exceeded what they'd expected. The old Oliver from Gus's back pasture was still in the equipment yard, still working. The men who had watched Donnie put it there in 1962 and who drove past the Farrell operation in the early 1970s and saw it in the line of machines, alongside the 1800 and the second 88 and the growing implement collection, had a complicated reaction to it. It was in some ways embarrassing to their earlier assessments. The machine they had assumed was junk had become the foundation of a real operation. Some of them said so directly, which was the best thing they could do. Some of them said nothing and updated their assessment in private. A small number continued to find reasons why the success was temporary or conditional or somehow not quite what it appeared. Donnie paid attention to none of these reactions. He was farming. Part 10. The Farm at 40 and at 60. Donnie Farrell was 40 years old in 1986, and the farm he had built from a $50 Oliver and a $7 weekly wage was, by any measurement that farming uses to measure itself, a real farm. He owned, outright, 438 acres in Darke County, the Weidner farm, which he had completed purchasing from Gus's estate in 1978 after Gus died, plus 3 other parcels he had bought over the years at prices that reflected the same patient approach to land acquisition that he had applied to equipment acquisition. He rented an additional 220 acres. He ran a fleet of 6 tractors, all Oliver or White Farm equipment, all paid for, the oldest being the 1956 Oliver 88 that had started everything, which had been comprehensively rebuilt twice and was now in secondary duty for light work. He had a daughter, Linda, who was 12 in 1986, and a wife, Carol, whom he had married in 1974, and who handled the farm books with the precision that farm books require, and who had the specific quality of understanding the farm, not just as an operation, but as the thing that Donnie had built it into, the physical expression of a decision made by a 16-year-old boy on the steps of a grain elevator. He had no debt on equipment. He had a land note on one of the parcels, manageable and decreasing. He had the equipment fund still. The same spiral notebook category that he had started in 1962 had evolved into a formal farm account line. But it was the same thing. Money set aside specifically for equipment, not to be touched for other purposes. The 1980s farm crisis that devastated many operations in Darke County and across the Midwest. Falling commodity prices combined with the high interest rate debt that farmers had taken on in the expansion years of the late 1970s moved through the Farrell operation without the catastrophic damage it produced elsewhere. Not without difficulty. The commodity prices hit everyone who grew corn and soybeans, and Donnie grew corn and soybeans. But the equipment debt did not exist. The land debt was modest. The equipment fund provided a buffer. He farmed through the crisis years and came out the other side with the operation intact and, in 1985 and 1986, had bought 2 additional parcels from operations that were liquidating under bank pressure at prices that reflected the distress of the sellers. He was 40 years old and he was farming 658 acres, paid for, or nearly paid for, with a fleet that had no notes against it, and the 1956 Oliver 88 was still in the yard. He was 60 years old in 2006, and the farm was different and the same. Different. Linda had come back to the farm after college and had been farming alongside him since 1997, and the operation had grown to just over 800 acres, and the equipment fleet had modernized in the specific way that operations modernize when they have no debt and available capital. Not by chasing the newest machines, but by replacing machines when the economics actually warranted replacement, rather than when a salesman's calendar warranted it. The same. The 1956 Oliver 88 was still in the yard. Linda had asked more than once why it was still there. Donnie had said it earned its place. Linda had said it hadn't turned a wheel in 6 years. Donnie had said it still earned its place. She had not pushed it further because she understood, having heard the story in the specific way that children of farmers hear stories, not once in a formal telling but continuously, in the accumulated context of a life lived on a farm that was built from something, that the Oliver in the yard was not a piece of equipment anymore. It was the answer to the question of how this farm came to exist. See Part 11. What Donnie said. When Linda Farrell asked her father the question directly when she was 34 years old, standing in the equipment yard on a November afternoon when the field work was done and they were doing the end-of-season walkthrough of the fleet. She asked, what would have happened if you hadn't fixed the Oliver? If you'd used the $43 for something else and walked away from it? Donnie thought about the question. He was 60 years old and he had been asked versions of it before, by neighbors, by a journalist who had written a short piece about the operation for an agricultural publication in 2002, by his own wife in the early years of their marriage when the past came up in conversation. He had always answered in general terms. He answered Linda specifically. He said, I would have kept working for Gus. I might have rented ground eventually, maybe not the Peck 40, because I wouldn't have had the ledger record that convinced Elsie Peck I was reliable. Maybe some other ground later. I would have built something. Linda said, but not this. Donnie said, I don't think this. I think the Oliver was the thing that made me believe the rest was possible. Not because of what the machine was, because of what fixing it proved to me. Linda said, what did it prove? Donnie said, that I could take something that everyone else had given up on and make it work again. I was 16 years old and I had nothing, and I fixed a broken diesel engine with $11 and a service manual, and it ran. After that, I knew that the starting point wasn't the limit. Linda looked at the 1956 Oliver parked at the end of the equipment yard. She said, is that why you keep it? Donnie said, that's why I keep it. She looked at it for a while. She said, it still runs, doesn't it? Donnie said it had been started every spring and every fall for 60 years, even the years it wasn't working. You kept the engine alive even when the machine was in secondary duty. Linda said, I'll keep doing that. He looked at her. He said, I know you will. They went back to the walkthrough. Epilogue. The grain elevator steps. There is a grain elevator in Ansonia, Ohio that has been on the same site since before Donnie Farrell was born. It has changed over the decades, new equipment installed, old equipment replaced. The business model evolved as the agricultural economy around it evolved. But the building is still there, and the steps are still there. The concrete steps at the front entrance where a 16-year-old boy sat on a Thursday morning in June of 1962 with $43 and a paper bag with 2 shirts in it and tried to figure out what came next. Donnie drove past it regularly his entire farming life because the county road that connected his farm to the main highway ran past the elevator. He drove past it in the Oliver 88, later in the 1800, later in the succession of machines that replaced the succession of machines. He drove past it in the pickup for decades of errands that took him through Ansonia. He never stopped at the steps. Not from avoidance. There was nothing to avoid. The steps were steps. The memory was not painful. The starting point had not become the limit. He had no need to return to it symbolically or to mark the distance between then and now. The farm marked the distance without any help from ceremony. 800 acres owned or rented. A fleet of equipment with no notes against it. A daughter who had come back to the land and who would farm it after him with the same patient arithmetic he had applied since 1962. A 1956 Oliver 88 diesel in the equipment yard, rebuilt twice, started every spring and every fall for 60 years, earned its place. The $43 had become a farm. The $50 Oliver had become the foundation. The boy on the grain elevator steps had become the man who built it. He drove past the elevator on his way to town, the way he had always driven past it, and he kept going. The farm was behind him. It was always behind him, in the best sense of that word. The thing built from nothing that holds you up when you need it to. Inter-expansion, Part 2. Continuation, what Donnie noticed about the Oliver. Before he asked. The 4 times Donnie returned to the 1956 Oliver in the back pasture before he asked Gus about buying it produced specific observations that formed the basis of his assessment. He approached each visit differently, each time answering a question the previous visit had raised. The first return visit, 3 days after arrival, was a general inspection. He walked around the machine looking at the visible condition, the cedar that had grown around it, the rust on the wheel rims, the degraded seat, the condition of the sheet metal. His assessment: bad cosmetically, structurally intact. The frame showed no cracks. The axle housings were present and unbroken. The hood was dented but complete. The tires were flat and probably cracked. He could not assess them visually through the rust, but he filed the tire condition as a known unknown. The second visit, 1 week after arrival, was underneath. He lay in the pasture grass on his back and looked at the engine and transmission from below. He was looking for oil pan damage, cracks in the block, evidence of catastrophic failure that would be visible from underneath. He found none of these. The oil pan was intact. The block had no visible cracks from the accessible angles. The underside showed 8 years of sitting and weather, but nothing that looked like the consequence of a mechanical catastrophe. The third visit, 2 weeks after arrival, was the compression check. It was a crude method. He could not use a compression gauge without pulling an injector, and pulling an injector required tools he did not yet have. He checked the compression by feel, removed the fuel injector access covers, placed his palm over the openings, and turned the engine over by hand using the flywheel. The resistance he felt in each cylinder was roughly consistent. No cylinder was dramatically easier to turn than the others, which would have indicated a severely damaged or failed piston or valve. The compression was reduced from the 8 years of sitting, but it was present and roughly equal across cylinders. The fourth visit was the injection pump. He found the access panel, removed it with a borrowed screwdriver, and looked at the pump with a flashlight. He found the cracked fuel line he would later confirm as the source of the pump's failure. A hairline crack at the fitting where the fuel supply entered the pump, visible as a dark stain of old dried fuel around the fitting. He found the pump body itself undamaged. The cracked line had allowed air into the fuel system, which had caused cavitation in the pump over time, but the pump body was intact and the damage appeared to be in the internal components that could be replaced rather than in the housing itself. He formed his assessment. The machine needed an injection pump or a comprehensive pump rebuild, plus the cracked fuel line, plus whatever additional issues the 8 years of sitting had produced in the rubber seals and the lesser components. It was a real repair job, but it was a repair job, not a parts machine. He asked about it the Saturday after the fourth visit. The $50 he paid was, he calculated, approximately what the machine was worth as scrap iron. He was not paying for scrap. He was paying for the specific gap between what the machine appeared to be worth and what it would be worth when it ran. And he was paying that gap price because he was the only person who had done the 4 visits and formed the specific assessment that the gap was closable. This was the same calculation he would make, in various forms, for the next 40 years of equipment acquisition, the gap between apparent value and actual value, closed by knowledge and work. The $50 Oliver was the first instance of a method that would define his operation. Expansion, Part 5, Continuation, the ledger and why he kept it. Donnie Farrell started keeping the farm ledger in March of 1963, the month he began his custom fieldwork operation, and he kept it without interruption for the rest of his farming life. The ledger was not something anyone told him to keep. He had not taken accounting classes. He had not read books on farm financial management. He had started it because his situation, no family, no safety net, no margin for error, made him acutely aware that the only information he could rely on absolutely was information he had recorded himself. The ledger was simple in structure. Each page represented a month. Income on the left column, itemized by source. Custom work with the name of the hiring farmer and the hours and the rate. Farm income with the crop type and the yield and the price. The equipment fund contributions that he transferred from operating income at the end of each month. Expenses on the right column. Fuel, parts, seed, fertilizer, rent payments, and a separate line that he labeled Equipment Fund Withdrawal, when he spent from the fund on a machine. The equipment fund line was the discipline. It existed as a separate accounting category from the beginning because Donnie had understood, without anyone explaining it to him, that money with a specific designation behaves differently from money in a general account. General account money is available for anything. Money in the equipment fund was available only for equipment purchased without debt. The designation was not a legal restriction. It was a personal commitment made visible on a page, and visible commitments are harder to violate than invisible ones. By 1966, when he approached Elsie Peck about the tenancy, the ledger had 3 years of entries showing income, expenses, and the equipment fund growing incrementally every month. He had brought the ledger to that conversation because he had nothing else to show. No land of his own, no family history in the county, no established reputation. The ledger was the evidence. It said, "This person accounts for what he earns and spends, has been doing so for 3 years, does not live beyond the numbers, and the numbers are going the right direction." Elsie Peck had looked at it for a long time. She had said his handwriting was very neat. He had said he'd worked at it. What he hadn't said was that the neatness of the handwriting was itself a form of discipline, that writing the numbers clearly and consistently was part of the practice of paying attention to them, and paying attention to the numbers was the thing that made the numbers go the right direction. He brought the ledger to every significant financial conversation for the rest of his farming life. To the bank when he first needed an operating line in 1967. To Gus when the ownership share conversation happened in 1969. To the attorney who handled the Widener farm purchase in 1978. To Carol when they were deciding what the farm could afford in the early years of their marriage. Carol had looked at the ledger early in their marriage, in 1975, and had said something that he had thought about many times since. She said, "You've been keeping this since you were 17. He said yes. She said, "How many years did you think you were going to farm when you started?" He said he hadn't known. He said he'd started it because he needed to know what he had, and he'd kept it because keeping it was easier than stopping. She had looked at him for a moment. She had said, "That's how everything good gets built. You start doing the right thing because you need to. Then you keep doing it because stopping is harder than continuing." He had thought about that for years. Expansion. Part 7. Continuation. The Oliver Fleet Decision. The specific decision to stay with Oliver equipment through the period when the Oliver brand was struggling. White Motor Company purchased Oliver in 1960, and the brand went through the instabilities of that transition through the 1960s and 1970s, was a decision that Donnie was occasionally asked to explain. He explained it this way: He had learned Oliver equipment from the inside. He had disassembled, understood, and rebuilt the 1956 Oliver 88 at age 16. He had learned the 88 diesel engine from the service publication before he had any hands-on experience with it. He had extended that knowledge to the 1959 88 and then to the 1963 1800, and by the mid-1960s he had the kind of deep system knowledge of Oliver diesel engines that came from years of working on the same family of machines, knowing not just how they worked but how they failed, how the failures could be prevented, and how they could be repaired when prevention had not worked. This knowledge had a real economic value. A mechanic or dealer service department charges labor for work that a farmer with system knowledge does himself. Over 40 years of farming, the cost difference between calling a dealer and doing the work in the equipment barn was a substantial number. He could not precisely calculate it, but he knew the direction and the approximate magnitude. It was one of the reasons his equipment costs per acre were consistently below what neighbors who ran newer and more complex machines spent. He had also made the specific judgment, based on his experience with the 1800 and the machines that followed in the Oliver White line, that the core engineering of the Oliver large-frame diesel was sound. The engine family that Oliver had developed in the 1950s and that White had continued was reliable at the fundamental level, and reliability in the fundamental level was more important than features at the margin. When White Farm Equipment itself went bankrupt in 1985, a casualty of the farm crisis and the company's own financial management, and the brand was eventually acquired and the parts supply situation became complicated, Donnie had adapted. He had stockpiled critical wear parts, injection components, gaskets, specific hydraulic seals, in the years before the bankruptcy, when the supply chain was still intact and the parts were available. He had done this because he read the industry news and he saw the White financial situation deteriorating, and he drew the obvious practical conclusion. The stockpile sustained the fleet through the transition period until the parts supply situation normalized under the new ownership. It was an unglamorous solution. It was the solution that worked. This was Donnie Farrell's method, applied to a different problem. See the specific situation clearly, understand the mechanism, act on the understanding before the urgency arrives. The 16-year-old who had identified the cracked fuel line as the root cause of the injection pump failure, rather than treating the pump failure as the fundamental problem, was the same person who had read the White Farm Equipment financial news and stocked gaskets. The method was the same. The application was 40 years apart. Expansion, Part 8. Continuation. The full weight of the Widener offer. The conversation that Gus Widener initiated in February of 1969 was not the first time Donnie had thought about the Widener farm's future. He had lived on the property for 7 years. He knew the ground. He knew the specific qualities of each field. The wet corner in the north field that needed tile attention, the clay ridge in the south field that compacted easily and required careful timing, the bottomland strip along the creek that produced exceptional yields in dry years and was inaccessible in wet ones. He knew the farm the way you know something you have been responsible for, from the inside, with the specific intimacy of long attention. When Gus made the offer, the part that Donnie processed most carefully was the section about price. Gus had set a fair price. The question was, fair to whom and how measured? In a farm transaction between people with a power differential, an established farmer with a property and a young man with no land, fair price is not always what it appears. He had asked to see the county tax assessment on the property. Gus had provided it. He had driven to the Dark County Courthouse on the following Saturday and looked at recent comparable farm sales in the county's deed records. He had formed his own assessment of the Widener farm's market value based on the comparables. The number Gus had in mind for the 25% was within 10% of Donnie's independent assessment. He was satisfied that fair meant what it appeared to mean. He had also, in the 2 weeks of thinking, worked through the mechanism of the staged transfer that Gus was proposing. The right of first purchase on the remaining 75% was not a guaranteed outcome. It was a right, not an obligation. The price at the time of transfer would be set then, not now. If the farm appreciated substantially between 1969 and whenever the full transfer happened, he might be paying significantly more than the current value for the remaining share. He had thought about this risk. He had decided it was acceptable. The reason was simple. The alternative was to continue renting land that was always at risk of the landowner's changing circumstances, versus participating in the ownership of ground he had farmed for 7 years and knew well. Ownership, even partial ownership, with future uncertainty in the full transfer price, was structurally more stable than tenancy. He had said yes. The 25% transfer had happened. The farming had continued. Gus had died in 1978 of a heart attack at 71, and the remaining 75% had come to Donnie through the estate, at a price that reflected the farm's 1978 market value, significantly above the 1969 price, as he had anticipated as a risk, but within what the farm had earned in the 9 years since the initial transfer. He had paid for it from farm income. It had taken 4 years. The Weidner farm was fully his by 1982, clear title, no note. He had stood in the north field, the one with the wet corner he'd been meaning to tile since 1965, after the last payment cleared, and had thought about Gus on the grain elevator steps in June of 1962, about what Gus had seen in a 16-year-old boy sitting on those steps with $43 in a paper bag that he had found worth betting on. He had put the tile in the north corner field that fall. It was something he had owed Gus for a long time. Expansion. Part 9. Continuation. Carol and the Farm. Books. Carol Farrell had been keeping the farm book since 1974, and she had her own perspective on what the numbers showed that sometimes differed from Donnie's, and that she expressed when she believed the expression was warranted. In 1981, when the farm crisis was beginning and the commodity prices were moving in directions that made the operating projections uncomfortable, she had sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers from 1963 through 1981 and done a calculation that she had been thinking about for several years. She calculated the aggregate cost of the equipment financing that the farm had not incurred, the interest that would have been paid if Donnie had financed each equipment purchase on the standard 7-year note that most of his neighbors used. She used the actual prevailing rates for each year, which she had in the ledger as context. She calculated the notional payment amounts for each purchase. She added the interest components across 18 years. The number was large. It represented money that had stayed in the farm's operating account instead of flowing to a lending institution. It was, she calculated, roughly equivalent to the price of 2 of the land parcels Donnie had purchased with cash from distressed sellers in the late 1970s. She showed him the calculation. He looked at it. He said, "I knew it was large. I didn't know it was that large." She said, "You started the equipment fund at 16. You've been building this gap for 18 years. He said, "The gap is the farm." She said, "The gap is the farm." They sat with that for a while. Then she asked about the operating line for the coming season, which needed to be confirmed with the bank, and they went back to the specific business at hand. But the calculation stayed. She updated it every 5 years through the rest of the farming operation: 1981, 1986, 1991, 1996, 2001, 2006. Each time the gap grew, because each year that passed added 1 more year of interest not paid. By 2006, when Donnie was 60 years old and the farm was at its largest and the operation was as solid as it had ever been, the aggregate number represented a sum that would have required selling the farm to raise. The farm was not sold. The gap remained. That was the point. The 1956 Oliver was in the yard. The ledger was in the farm office filing cabinet. The 1963 entries still readable. The handwriting still neat. The farm that started with a $50 machine and $11 in a 16-year-old's pocket was 800 acres and a lifetime of careful arithmetic. Nobody had given him anything. He had fixed the Oliver. He had kept the ledger. He had paid the equipment fund before he paid himself. The rest, the slow accumulation of land and equipment and stability and the particular respect of a community that had watched it happen from the beginning, was the consequence of the first 3 things, compounded over decades. That is not a mystery. It is arithmetic,